You used the phrase, which I thought was really explained it to me, that the U.S. policy too often sought to speed the movement of the arc of history. Did he perceive American foreign policy, particularly in the context of the Middle East and whatnot, to be that a benign and earnest of a force? Maybe benign is not the right word, but that earnest of a force that like we're just following the arc of history here, or did he perceive foreign policy to be attempting to intervene in the arc of history? That's my first question, and I guess a subset of that was it the case that when he became president that we had already sort of exhausted our ability to intervene, that we had, I guess along the lines of we had a greater investment in the Middle East than our interests warranted, but had we already exhausted our abilities? Were we basically writing checks that we couldn't cash anymore because we had gone too far in terms of exhausting ourselves militarily, but also in terms of exhausting any type of supposed moral leadership?
On your first question, one of Obama's biggest contributions to how we think about and how we formulate American foreign policy, but also one of the ones that guaranteed he would always be somewhat isolated, was his insistence that it wasn't one or the other, it was both. That sometimes the U.S. action in the world was a force for progress, doing deeply immoral things. Other times it was forcing events in the world in directions that perhaps the people we were pushing on didn't want to go and that perhaps weren't right or just. That he both believed that colonialism had been a problem and that the U.S. could be and had been a force for good in the world. And that's a pretty lonely position across the spectrum of American foreign policy, because you're supposed to believe one or the other, and there's just not a lot of cultural patience for people who insist on both being true. As far as the second, it's interesting to look at Obama's evolution over his time in office. And this, frankly, is a piece that Jeff Goldberg has written a little bit about, but that hasn't been written yet. That I think perhaps Obama comes into office maybe believing that there are a lot of checks written that can't be cashed. And then he put over and over again in the situation, damn it, Mr. President, X has just happened, come up with a check. And so I think one of the ways that you can understand his evolution in office and his embrace of the targeted killing program as a way to try to control the growth of terrorist groups, his sort of dabbling on the edges of Syria, but at the same time choosing not to go in the big ways he was pushed to by a lot of others, is trying to come up, concluding that he wanted, I don't want to beat your cashing checks metaphor to death, but that he maybe wanted or felt the necessity of having more tools than perhaps he had assumed at the beginning.
I'm sorry. He thought he could do more with less.
He discovered that there was more that needed to be done, or there was more that he couldn't escape doing. And I think this comes through. This comes through pretty clearly in some of his interviews in The Atlantic. That it's very hard, I think, for anyone to anticipate the sheer number of world events that the President of the United States is asked to do something about. And the sheer accretion, both in the U.S. but also overseas, and I think this is a point that people who favor a less active U.S. engagement maybe don't understand, is just how much of the foreign and national security policy establishments in the rest of the world are built on the assumption that the U.S. is going to show up and do something. Whether you like that or whether you don't like it, whether you're built to take advantage of that or, frankly, whether you're built to push back against it, so much of the architecture of how the rest of the world works was assuming that the U.S. would show up and do something in Iraq or in Syria or in Ukraine or in Ivory Coast or in Kenya or in Mali. I could go on and on and on and on. So as an American president, I frankly think Obama, as Trump, as anyone would, just underestimated the sheer number of places where people would walk in the door and say, if you don't do something, nobody will. And even someone who has a pretty resolute belief that some of the times the answer to that question should be, okay, then nobody will, just the sheer number of things that the U.S. is looked to do something about, and the degree to which it turned out not to be correct, that other countries were ready to just jump right in and do it. And so then you were faced with, well, really, okay, no one else is going to do. Nope, still no one else is going to do anything. And maybe something that wasn't a core U.S. interest, if you assumed someone else was going to manage it, if no one else was going to manage it, then it got harder to say, no, we shouldn't do anything. And I think that's the dilemma that Obama faced as time went on.
So when we talk about core interest in that thing, there seems to be two sides of the ledger, right? It's how much will this impact the United States, and how much will it impact, and what are the chances that it will resolve itself? I mean, do I hear that right? Because our interests are our interests. And if we only have let's say out of a 10, a level 3 interest in something that's happening somewhere in the world, the idea that someone is going to fix it or not fix it, it doesn't change that level of value to us. It's a 3. Now, I can make a decision based upon the fact that, there's a 25% chance that someone's going to fix it, and salvage that number 3 level interest of ours, or there's a 95% chance that someone's going to fix it, and that can influence my behavior as well. But theoretically, right, the administration has an immutable sense of what the value of that interest is.
Theoretically, the other problem, and here I think Syria is a good example, is that you have an interest that is only a 3 unless it gets totally out of control and sparks a conflagration in the neighboring countries, in which case suddenly it's a 7. And if you look at Syria and you say, how much of a core security interest does the U.S. have in how Assad treats his citizens? And there, the U.S. has some interest because we say that we have values and we support dignity and human rights, but it's limited. If, however, it turns out that the way the leader of Syria treats his citizenry sparks a civil war, then maybe there's a higher interest because maybe we have some greater concerns with neighboring countries and so on. But that's still, you can make, and people have made, a strong argument that it's manageable. If you knew through omnipotence in advance that the situation in Syria was going to lead to a massive refugee exodus, which would destabilize European politics and contribute to the crippling of the European Union and the falling of friendly governments in a number of Western European countries, giving Russian intelligence agents the opening to push even further, to push out friendly governments, then suddenly you say to yourself, whoa, that's a major interest of the U.S. And if the Syrian refugee outflow and the accompanying ability of ISIS and ISIS-affiliated loners to wreak the havoc that they've wreaked in Western Europe with the knock-on effects that have happened, if one had omnipotently been able to see at the beginning that forestalling Syria getting turned into a free fire zone, or parts of Syria getting turned into a free fire zone, could have forestalled that, would that have been a core U.S. interest? Yes, it would.
Right.
Now, are we omnipotent? Can we see that? No, we can't.
And
does that necessarily mean that anyone should have done anything differently? No, but that is a case of something that started out as a 3 and has wound up as an 8 or 9.
And even if we had that omnipotence and an ability to see, there would still be a debate as to how do we how do we prevent it from growing from a 3 into a 9, right? Do we support Assad or do we support the rebels of who are people who we don't even know necessarily who they are?
Right. The observation, just the observation by itself, doesn't remove the policy dilemma. But how can I put it? It is the case that while you can certainly make the argument that American core interests are immutable, challenges to American core interests are not immutable. If you see what I mean?
Yes.